one of our real challenges is the concentration of power in the AI industry. And because of that, who is setting the agenda for the regulatory and legislative environment? And so one of the things that I am watching really closely is essentially who is at the table. How are we deciding what our national priorities are?
I'm Quinta Jurecic, a senior editor at Lawfare, and this is the Lawfare podcast, October 5th, 2023. Today we're bringing you an episode of Arbiters of Truth, our series on the information ecosystem. And we're discussing the hot topic of the moment, artificial intelligence. There are a lot of less than informed takes out there about AI and whether it's going to kill us all. So I'm glad to be able to share an interview that hopefully cuts through some of that noise. Janet Haven is the executive director of the nonprofit Data and Society and a member of the National Artificial Intelligence Advisory Committee, which provides guidance to the White House on AI issues. I sat down alongside Matt Perault, director of the Center on Technology and Policy at UNC-Chapel Hill, to talk through our questions about AI governance with Janet. We discussed how she evaluates the dangers and promises of artificial intelligence, how to weigh the different concerns posed by possible future existential risk to society posed by AI versus the immediate potential downsides of AI in our everyday lives, and what kind of regulation she'd like to see in this space. It's the Lawfare podcast, October 5th, talking AI with Data and Society's Janet Haven.
So you're the executive director of Data in Society. Could you give us a little sense of what your organization does and the role that you hope it can play in the tech ecosystem?
Yeah, absolutely. So Data and Society is an independent nonprofit research and policy institute. We study the societal implications of data-centric technologies, automation, and AI, and we translate that knowledge into unfolding policy and media debates. Fundamentally, what we believe is that how societies choose to design and govern technology will be a determinant of our collective future, and that it's really, really critical that the right voices are at the table to do that work, and that governance process is happening in a way that's based on empirical knowledge. And that's why it's really critical for us to be contributing a body of empirical research to those governance debates.
So you've been doing a lot of writing and speaking about artificial intelligence, which it seems like is the only thing that anyone wants to talk about in the tech space right now, kind of crowding out other issues. From your perspective, what are the areas of concern in terms of thinking about how to grapple with, regulate this emerging technology, and how confident are you that public policy can address those concerns?
Yeah, so at the highest level, I'm concerned about two things. From the public policy perspective, I'm extremely concerned about the lack of public oversight and of regulation over how technology, which is of course a huge part of the economy and a huge part of just about every person's lived experience, the lack of oversight and regulation in terms of how that's governed in our society. And I do think that public policy can address that. I think it's been hard to do that. We haven't seen movement on that to the extent we would have wanted to over the past decade and a half, thinking inclusively about technology regulation and not just AI. But I think that we can address that, and I think that there's a real groundswell of attention to that. From a broader societal perspective, I'm concerned about the lack of agency that I think many people experience about technology in their lives. And I'm concerned about the correlating lack of shared spaces that we have to work through a set of questions that may or may not be regulatory policy questions, but more about the values that we want to prioritize when it comes to technology and society. So I'm worried that we don't have the space to step back and say, what should we automate? What are the real trade-offs for people and communities when we automate aspects of education or of elder care work or of early child care work or of accessing public benefits or finding job opportunities or shaping our information environments? So I think we have a real gap in how the public conversation is unfolding. And I think it's been significantly enclosed and foreclosed because of who's defining the shape of that conversation, who's really at the table and is driving the conversation, which at this point is really primarily the tech companies and more generally, I think people in technical roles, computer scientists and so forth.
Yeah, so I want to push you on that to dive into the specifics. And you kind of got to it near the end, but when you say, you're concerned there's a lack of public space for conversations that need to be had, a sort of focus on a particular kind of perspectives. Can you be more specific about whose perspectives you think are coming through and whose we need to hear more of?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that what we're seeing in the public policy discussion that's happening, primarily at the federal level right now on the Hill, is that AI company executives and technologists, computer scientists are primarily setting the public policy agenda. Policymakers on the Hill are literally asking the people who would be regulated whether and if and how to regulate them. And so, unsurprisingly, I think what we're seeing take center stage are the issues that are most beneficial to those companies and are areas where they can stand regulation without having their business models impacted. I think we're also seeing a push to focus on, what's known as X risk, existential risk to humanity concerns about AI, rather than a focus on the more immediate harms that people are experiencing right now from AI systems.
So you said in the outset when you were telling us a little bit about data and society that your organization is a bridge between research and policy and that you're really trying to integrate empirical work into the work that policymakers do. I'm curious if you can apply that lens a little bit to how you see AI. What are you seeing in the literature that points to certain directions of how we should think about governance?
So I can talk through a few of the kind of primary, I think, points of concern that are well supported in the empirical literature. So a first big area of concern and attention, I think, is algorithmic discrimination. So what we have seen is that AI systems can produce inaccurate, biased, and discriminatory outcomes, often because the data that's fed into those systems reflects the historical and social inequities that exist in the real world. So those are captured and translated into the data sets that power the AI that we're using. And so the even bigger challenge there is that the scope and the scale of AI means that those embedded biases and those algorithmic failures are going to have very, very far-reaching effects. So that's one of the big concerns. A second concern is the lack of explainability of AI systems. And I think that I want to sort of differentiate between the idea of transparency and explainability. So transparency is essentially seeing, what goes into the data sets, for instance, and I think that is really important. Explainability is about the fact that most AI systems are black boxes that produce results that aren't easily explained or challenged, even in court, despite the fact that they can affect people's lives in very dramatic ways. And that's a real problem because one of the pushbacks that we see from technical actors in this space is that, explainability is just not possible with many AI systems. I think that that's something that we need to challenge, right? That is a question about how systems are built. That is a question about choices that have been made, perhaps quite early on in technical development and design, but it's still a choice. And I think that the idea that it isn't is something that we need to contest. I mean, a third area that I think is really critical, again, well supported in the literature, is the impact of a lack of meaningful participation in the design of AI systems. So even with the best of intentions, scientists who build AI systems often lack perspective or context to understand the real world impacts of their design choices. And the companies that are building these systems, that are supporting the building of these systems, lack currently the hard law, the legal incentives to spend their money, because it costs money to ensure real participation. But they lack those legal incentives to ensure meaningful participation of impacted communities in the design and deployment of these systems. Just as a small plug, Data and Society actually yesterday just released a paper called Democratizing AI that is specifically on principles for public participation. This was written by Professor Michelle Gilman, who is an affiliate with Data and Society, and lays out a set of clear principles and practices that can facilitate public participation in the design and of both AI systems and of AI governance. And one of her core conclusions is this is something that needs to be legislated because it is expensive, it is challenging to do, and it takes real resources to do it well.
So for something like democratizing AI, is AI the problem or is it the solution? Meaning that, like, does it give us more routes to more avenues of democratic participation, or do you see it more on balance as a problem that stands in the way of that?
So my feeling on that is that we can get to AI as a benefit to societal participation and to any number of other public interest outcomes if we design for an innovation environment that pushes us in that direction and that pushes us towards safer, more trustworthy, and more equitable AI. And so I think that sort of rolls back up to the questions of designing a robust governance and accountability system for algorithmic systems more generally that tracks through the entire life cycle of an AI system, and that is thinking about it not only at the design stage but also at the deployment stage and at the end of life stage, right? Like how does a system retire and what are the impacts when a system comes out of its use?
And so walk me through, I feel like, these discussions often are so abstract. It's helpful to me to kind of really get into the details. In your perfect world, assuming that, we have AI systems that are used for, private enterprise, for public policy, what is kind of the ideal life cycle of this kind of innovative and regulatory environment? From, I'm AI developer, I sit down at my laptop to, put together a model, to how it's used, to, as you say, retiring. Like what would you want to see in terms of governance structures?
So I think that all of those puzzle pieces get put together is still a bit TBD. And there are a couple of reasons for that. I think one reason is I think that algorithmic systems and AI present some novel governance challenges, and the sort of methodologies of accountability are still being developed. We don't necessarily know all of the key pieces that are going to create that overall accountability system and that overall sense of societal trust. But I think there are some pretty critical pieces that we can point to right now. So a starting point, I think, an undergirding for all of this is is sort of close attention to data, both in terms of data privacy. So at this point, we lack in the United States comprehensive federal data privacy protections. I know you both know this very, very well. A year ago, the American Data Privacy and Protection Act, which was a bipartisan law that had a lot of backing from both industry and civil society, did not pass. And so that is a lack. I hope we take another shot at that, because I think if we don't have a baseline of agreement around data privacy, any kind of broader system of accountability for AI is really, really hard to get to.
And why is that, right? Like, for someone who hasn't been following this closely, what is the connection between the importance of privacy legislation and having sort of safe, adequately governed AI?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and is really, really important to draw out. The reason for that is because AI systems are built on massive data sets. And those data sets are particularly of the kinds of AI that is most fully in the public eye right now, like ChatGPT. Those data sets are built by scraping public information from all kinds of online sources, like the internet as a whole. And there's a lot of information that people share on the internet, on social media, in all kinds of places, on Twitter, et cetera, that they don't expect to be pulled into a broader system. They don't expect to be a source for algorithmic decision making. And I think one of the things that we lack is actually a full understanding of how in an algorithmic environment, in an AI driven environment, how our current approach to privacy, which is very individualized in the United States, is very much about individual protections, translates very poorly into a networked environment. In other words, if I am, tagging my friends on Facebook, and I have my own personal privacy settings set to, a high level of control, I have still given Facebook a set of information about the people that I have tagged without their consent. And that's what's known as networked privacy violation, and is something that, I think even with the ADPPA, we still have a gap in how we think about developing those protections. It is something I would think of as an under-theorized area of concern in AI policymaking and in legal theory.
And so, okay, so let's say, so that's the kind of we have privacy, that's the sort of development part. Then once we go to, this program is being used to do whatever example you want, right? I know there's examples about, for example, helping determine the conditions of release for people who are being booked on charges, which is a sort of an extreme example, but I think a demonstrative one about how important this can be to people's lives. What kind of regulatory structure do we want at that point?
Right. So there are a couple of pieces, some of which I mentioned earlier, that I think are really critical. So maybe as a very first stopping point on this big accountability cycle, we want to know that these systems actually work, right? That they do what they say they're going to do. And I think one of the big dirty secrets in the AI world is that a lot of quote unquote AI systems do not actually do what they say they're going to do. They either cannot, the kind of data that they have access to will not return the promised results, or they are making claims about what the data can tell us. For instance, making claims that a type of data set can return information about a person's emotional state. This is called affective computing. So that sort of layer of does the system actually do what it says it's going to do? I think is something that we have no controls over right now, and that we will absolutely need controls over. That's kind of just a first stop. And one of the tools that's proposed to address that is auditing. And so what auditing does, when you audit an AI system, what it does is that it essentially tests that system against a predetermined set of criteria. That is, and that criteria could be what the developer says the system is going to do. It could also be testing it against a law or a norm. So that's a really important step. And so, my hope is that we will see auditing come in as a very important part of the governance toolkit. A second layer of that, a second part of the governance toolkit that we really need to have are called algorithmic impact assessments. And this is something my organization, Data and Society, works on quite a bit. We recently launched something called the Algorithmic Impact Methods Lab. And so what an algorithmic impact assessment does is that it essentially tests a system, an AI system, and what happens with it when it actually meets real people. So it tests the impacts, it assesses the impacts of that system in a real world environment with real people. And particularly, it can be with impacted communities who are very unlikely to have been part of the design process of that system at the very beginning.
Janet, we'd love to hear a little bit more about the Algorithmic Impact Methods Lab. Can you give us a sense of how you set that up and how it will work in practice?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've been working on the issue of algorithmic impact assessments for several years at Data and Society because for two reasons. So one is this issue that impact assessments ask what the consequences of a system are when it meets the real world. And that aligns very closely with how Data and Society approaches these research questions around technology and society. That is, we're very interested in how people and technology exist together, what the impacts are in both directions. And so that, for us, was a very critical way of thinking about technology and society. It turns out that algorithmic impact assessments have also become a part of a number of prospective or proposed laws, including the Algorithmic Accountability Act of 2022 that Senator Wyden proposed. They're also part of the EU AI Act. And so it looks like there's some cohesion around the idea that assessing that sort of technology meets the real world piece is going to be really important in understanding the accountability of an AI system. The challenge there is that we don't have an agreed on methodology for impact assessments. And the worst case scenario when you don't have a methodology is that should this become law or a norm, that tends to get left to the companies to decide how to do those assessments. And the challenge there is then we don't have a counterbalance from the public interest perspective. So what the Algorithmic Impact Methods Lab was launched to do is to develop, in consultation with a range of partners, a gold standard methodology for algorithmic impact assessments done in the public interest. So what we're not actually planning to do impact assessments ourselves at any great scale. What we're interested in doing is designing a methodology that is robust, that centers the public interest and public participation, and that others can pick up and use as this accountability tool becomes more and more prevalent.
So I want to back up a little to something you mentioned earlier that, what you're really trying to focus on is sort of the immediate risks of AI to people's actual lives in the near future, and that's what these sort of systems are meant to provide. And that is sort of contrasts with some of the concerns that other folks, including obviously the person who springs to mind is Sam Altman at OpenAI, what they've been talking about, which is it seems to be something along the lines of like total societal collapse because no one needs human workers the machines will take over and we'll have a sort of 2001, I'm sorry, Dave, Skynet situation. It's not totally clear to me what they're envisioning in terms of, the destruction of the world from AI. But that has kind of come into focus as, the big thing that everyone is terribly worried about. There was an Atlantic article recently, for example, about how, all the AI researchers are reading this book on the making of the atomic bomb and sort of comparing themselves to Oppenheimer, which there's some other stuff going on there that we don't need to talk about here.
For sure.
But in all seriousness, what do you make of this? So first off, are you concerned about AI destroying the world? And second off, how should we balance those concerns with the maybe less sexy but also important concerns that you've been voicing so far?
My take on this debate is that it's not really necessary to frame it into an either or. Two things can be true at once. It can be true that there are a set of concerns about existential risk to humanity from AI. I will say, as a sidebar, I find it somewhat odd that the people who are raising those concerns most vocally are also the people who have the immediate opportunity to, limit their development. And we don't see that happening. So I guess that makes me wonder, to some extent, how severe those concerns really are. But I also don't necessarily think that I'm in the best position to assess that. I think I and others in this field that data and society works in are in a good position to assess that immediate harms are severe and have empirically been shown to exist and that they need attention. And I would also argue that the steps that we want to take to address immediate concerns and immediate harms, that is the kind of accountability frameworks that we're talking about in this conversation, are going to put us on the right road to preventing the kind of existential risk that I think some others are talking about. So, my problem with something like the AI pause letter was that, it didn't articulate much in terms of what should happen in that 6 months and who should be driving whatever those actions are. I don't think that it makes sense for us to assume that the tech is going to fix the tech or the tech industry is going to fix the tech. I think that what we need to address either set of concerns, both set of concerns, is a robust regulatory and legislative set of actions. And so I don't actually think that these two sets of concerns are so far apart. I just think that they're being articulated in different ways, and that declaring an end to humanity is something that does tend to capture the public conversation.
You've articulated a few specific areas that you'd want to see for that regulatory solution. But of course, the question is not just what would the substance be, it's also what's the political likelihood that we would see that substance come to fruition. And we haven't seen it in the last decade plus of tech regulation. There's been a lot of conversation about the regulation we need. And that's really, there's been a large gap between that conversation and the regulation we have. Are you more, I guess it depends on your framing, optimistic, pessimistic? What's your view of the likelihood that we will see some regulation to match the roadmap, the substantive roadmap that you've laid out?
I'm going to say I'm optimistic. This may come back to me later. But I will enclose that with saying I am optimistic about certain spaces for regulatory action and less sure about others. So I think we really have to give the Biden administration credit for the amount of work that they have done to advance, AI regulation on the executive side. They've not only released the AI Bill of Rights in October of 2022, which addressed issues like algorithmic discrimination and safe and equitable systems, but they also, through NIST, have released the AI risk management framework, which is a major achievement as well. And we've also seen things like Executive Order 14091, which took that concept of algorithmic discrimination from the AI Bill of Rights and made it into a directive from the president himself for all of the agencies to address and to protect Americans against. And so I think we're seeing real steps being taken on that side. We're also right now waiting for an executive order, a promised executive order that is meant to address a number of further issues about AI, which is forthcoming sometime in the coming few weeks. We've seen a number of companies adhere to a set of voluntary commitments that the White House put out that are meant to, advance safety and security in AI systems with some of the best known companies in this space. So I think that there's a fair amount happening there. I also think that we're seeing action on the state level. Governor Newsom, for instance, in California recently put out an executive order on AI that cited the AI Bill of Rights, for instance, as a core document to draw on. And we're seeing that happen in other states as well. So I think that is positive. I think the big open question is what's going to happen in Congress, right? Like what will happen in terms of a legislative agenda for AI? And there's plenty of competition for this. There are plenty of congressional members who are advancing frameworks. Senator Schumer's is probably the most visible, and he has pledged to have a number of insight forums this fall to essentially educate congressional members and to some extent the public on the range of AI issues that demand legislative attention. So I think that there is a fair amount happening. I think where I have the least certainty about how it's going to play out is on the legislative side, because of course, historically, we have seen so little happen in technology regulation, despite many, many hearings, many, many proposals over the course of the last 10 years.
Yeah, so that's the point I kind of want to push on a little bit more. Mm-hmm. Like if the roadmap that we wanted to see was convening of hearings in different forums and voluntary commitments from a small number of companies, press releases, op-eds about possible frameworks, messaging bills outlining what might happen. That's a policy roadmap that we have seen in the past. That is the last decade of tech regulation. It's not, I think, probably accurate or fair to say that nothing has happened. It's just, as you're pointing to now, there hasn't been much that's happened on the legislative front. So I think the question for AI about whether it's different is a little bit less about some of those other things, including probably like executive orders that impose constraints on federal government employee conduct or agency conduct, but not necessarily on what companies might do. The question is like, is there going to be legislative activity that is really going to change the regulatory framework that companies are able to operate in? Will it provide real guidance and narrowing of product and business decisions for companies? On that question specifically, are you seeing something here that suggests we're headed toward different outcomes than the place that we've been in for the last decade? Maybe.
I would say, just on one of your points there, before I answer that specific question, that I think that the behavior of federal agencies can actually have a huge impact on companies through procurement. And so that to me is a really big open question, is how will the federal government as a purchaser of software from the outside world use procurement practices and regulations to shape company behavior. So I think that is a way that the agency side extends potentially very far into the private sector. But take your point that, to really impact the private sector as a whole, we need, binding legislation. I am not completely without optimism on this, but I think that we face all of the same challenges that we faced with social media regulation, which really didn't move very far over the past 10 years, as you pointed out. I see the most hope in sort of two different directions around AI legislation, potential AI legislation. So one is that I think broadly there's a framing around AI safety, right, which is encompassing a whole set of ideas, right, from like existential risk to like more of a kind of like FDA type thing, like does the thing actually work, or is it going to return the results that it says it's going to return? And I think that I'm as you've heard, more interested in that first question, and how a tool like audits can be used to at least create a baseline that these systems work. And I think that there are significant economic and commercial reasons and incentives for that to move forward. So I would say I think that's a reasonable bet. I very much hope that we return to comprehensive data privacy protections. I think we got so close last year with the ADPPA, and I think that there's still at least some appetite to bring that back. And I guess the last thing I would say is I don't know is the real answer, but I think that there is a potential pathway forward that focuses on these kind of accountability questions. So the Algorithmic Accountability Act of 2022 that came out of Senator Wyden's office was really about how do we build a framework of sort of testing and process around systems of a certain size. And in some ways, I think that process focus and methodological focus can sidestep some of the more political issues that may sort of divert attention from a legislative agenda. I mean, I guess the last thing I'd be remiss not to say is that obviously in this space, a huge driver and a huge set of concerns that I think is fairly bipartisan is around national security and competitiveness, and specifically competitiveness with China. And so I think that could shape a legislative agenda in a way that isn't as directly focused on immediate societal harms and equity concerns that I am most interested in. But I think in terms of your question, Matt, of like, will anything happen? Like that is potentially the biggest lever to create action.
Yeah, I want to ask more about that. So again, kind of getting down to brass tacks, what are the ways that these sort of competition with China concerns are shaping how legislators and policymakers are thinking about AI regulation? And I think you said in an interview with Politico that it's maybe moving things in a direction other than what you might want to see. And you mentioned just now, it's focusing on issues other than sort of these safety concerns. What form does that take, just sort of in the mechanics of how people are discussing what to do? And is there a way to move away from that, or are we kind of headed in a bad direction because these competition security concerns have taken precedence?
So I think that it's a really complicated set of questions to untangle, because I think, again, two things can be true at once, right? Like I don't think that this is an either or situation. But I think that the kind of Venn diagram space in the middle is essentially, contestation over what innovation looks like, what we mean by innovation, and what kinds of sort of core values we want to use to define an innovation space for technology. And I think on one end of that spectrum, the idea that we are in a a direct competition with China, and that AI is one of the fundamental levers that we have, and that's being contested, sort of creates the space for the argument that any kind of regulatory environment is putting us at a disadvantage. I think that ignores the idea that we're seeing governance frameworks emerge in other parts of the world. The EU AI Act, China itself has defined a set of regulations that, if they were to be enacted in the way that they're written, are create a much more constrained environment than we have in the United States, certainly right now. But I think there's a great deal of uncertainty there in terms of, in terms of how those might be implemented and what they mean in reality for competition with the United States. So there's that bucket of concerns. There's certainly the bucket of concerns around access to chip manufacturing, which runs directly into, which right now is, primarily situated in Taiwan. There's a lot of concern, obviously, about the relationship with China and Taiwan, and the continuing access to chip manufacturing for United States companies. These are all real concerns. I think that on the sort of other end of the spectrum, we don't want to see an avoidance of creating the kinds of protections that we really need, for instance, against algorithmic discrimination in AI systems, because of a belief that that could constrain an innovation environment. And so, the way that I think about it is that what regulation does, that we shouldn't be thinking about it as either or, like either we get innovation or we get protection against, violations of civil rights, but that we should be thinking about it as we want to create an innovation environment in the United States that pushes us towards the kinds of technologies that are beneficial to society. And ultimately, I think technologies that are beneficial to society, that create protections that people trust and can live alongside and integrate into their work, into our justice systems, into educational systems, et cetera, in ways that are not harmful, strengthen the position of the United States.
So in the months and the year ahead, what things are you going to be keeping your eye out for when it comes to the development of AI and also conversations around AI policy and regulation?
I would argue that one of our real challenges is the concentration of power in the AI industry. And because of that, who is setting the agenda for the regulatory and legislative environment? And so one of the things that I am watching really closely is essentially who is at the table. How are we deciding, not sort of what our sort of granular pieces are of a governance framework, but how are we deciding what our national priorities are, what the core values are that are going to inform how the United States approaches governance of AI systems? And I would argue that this is something that we have a real gap in right now, that we really don't have a shared idea of what we most value when we think about designing an approach to governing AI. So the Office of Science and Technology Policy earlier this year put out a call for public comment on priorities for a national AI strategy. And I expect that their forthcoming executive order and probably other forthcoming communication from the White House will, give some insight into what they learned from that and how they ended up processing that. I think the best case scenario would be something that really puts forward a kind of vision for what we as a country want from AI and want to see. So thinking about it very much from an outcomes perspective rather than, coming at it from a kind of defensive crouch.
All right, let's leave it there. Janet, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
You've been listening to Arbiters of Truth, a Lawfare podcast series on the information ecosystem. The Lawfare podcast is produced in cooperation with the Brookings Institution. You can get ad-free versions of this and other Lawfare podcasts by becoming a Lawfare Materials supporter through our website, lawfaremedia.org/support. You'll also get access to special events and other content available only to our supporters. The podcast is edited by Jen Patja Howell, and your audio engineer this episode was Noah Mosband of Goat Rodeo. Our music is performed by Sophia Yan. As always, thanks for listening.